Jason Reed had always been a quiet man, not timid but measured, someone who preferred structure over chaos, peace over conflict. When he moved into Maple Hill Estates, it wasn't the manicured lawns or the pristine sidewalks that attracted him. It was the promise of control, the illusion of safety that came with rules and boundaries. He had spent 10 years as a systems engineer in Chicago, a career that demanded precision, order, and discretion, but the city wore him down. Crime, noise, unpredictability, it had all begun to chip away at his mental calm. He craved silence. So when he bought house number 41 on Maple Hill Lane, a charming two-story colonial with white shutters and a stone walkway, he thought he had finally found peace. But Jason had underestimated one thing: power doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it wears pearls and a name tag. And in Maple Hill Estates, that power came in the form of Karen Myers, the HOA president. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. She didn't have a job anyone could confirm, but she had time, endless time. Time to walk the streets at 7 a.m. with a clipboard and a coffee mug. Time to memorize every regulation in the HOA charter, and time to police anything and everything that disrupted her vision of suburban perfection. Jason didn't even realize she existed until 3 days after moving in. He had placed a simple ceramic wind chime on his porch, a small gift from his sister. That afternoon, an envelope arrived in his mailbox, official HOA letterhead, printed in perfect Helvetica font. Porch ornaments must be pre-approved by the HOA design committee. Jason chuckled and threw the notice in the trash. He wasn't part of the HOA. His property, grandfathered in before the HOA formed, was exempt. It was one of the reasons he had purchased that specific home. He had reviewed the property records thoroughly before closing the deal, but Karen didn't see it that way. Rules were rules, and she didn't like exemptions. Over the next week, Jason noticed small changes. His trash cans were moved an inch closer to the street curb. His mail occasionally arrived late or not at all. One evening, he spotted a woman crouching near his hedge with a flashlight and a measuring tape. He stepped outside. She stood. "I'm checking for compliance," she said flatly. "You're too close to the setback line." Jason narrowed his eyes. "I'm not in the Her lips curled into a tight, professional smile. "That's not how we do things here." Jason closed the door. The next morning, a citation was taped to his front window. Unauthorized vegetation extending beyond regulation limits. Jason documented it, photographed it, filed it away. He wasn't interested in confrontation, but he knew how to build a case. That weekend, he installed a small outdoor security camera above his garage, not for show, but for evidence. He angled it toward the street, covering his driveway and the edge of his front lawn. Karen saw it 2 hours later. She walked past, stopped, stared. No smile this time, no clipboard, just a cold, hard glare. Jason knew the war had started. Monday came with a formal letter, hand-delivered in a sealed envelope. Exterior modifications must be submitted to the HOA architectural board. Security equipment must not interfere with the neighborhood's visual standards. Jason replied, with a printed copy of the state residential code, highlighting his exemption and the law allowing private security installations on personal property. He dropped it in Karen's mailbox. 2 days later, he received a final warning. Then, on a Thursday evening, at precisely 7:28 p.m., Jason was prepping dinner when he saw red and blue lights flash across his kitchen window. To police, cruisers rolled to a stop in front of his home. Jason stepped onto his porch.com, but wary. 2 officers emerged, hands near their belts, one with a body cam active. "Mr. Reed?" the taller one asked. "Yes, we received a 911 call. Anonymous tip said you were storing illegal materials in your garage, possibly dangerous chemicals, and that you'd been verbally threatening a neighbor." Jason blinked. "You're kidding." "Afraid not, sir. We'll need to have a look around." Jason nodded, said nothing. He led them to the garage, turned on the light. Clean, organized. Rakes, shovels, car supplies, a tool cabinet, a hose reel. No chemicals, no threats, just a man maintaining his home. "I also have something else," Jason said, walking back toward the porch. He pulled up the security feed on his tablet and showed the officers a clip from 2 hours earlier. Karen standing across the street, pointing at his house while talking on her cell phone. The timestamp matched the 911 call log. The officers glanced at each other. One of them sighed. "Sir, can we keep a copy of this footage?" Jason emailed it to them directly. They left with a report filed and a note logged in the system. Possible false report, harassment pattern. But Jason knew this wasn't over. The next morning, his mailbox was left open, contents scattered. Someone had stepped on his flower bed. His rear gate was unlocked. Nothing major, just enough to get under the skin. Jason filed a police report and called his attorney, not just any attorney, Elliot Crane, a quiet but razor-sharp legal mind who specialized in HOA abuse cases. When Jason explained the situation, Elliot listened silently, then said, "Document everything, every call, every message, every footprint. And don't confront her. Let her keep digging her own hole." And she did. Karen began distributing flyers to the neighborhood. "Is your neighbor dangerous? Do you feel safe on Maple Hill?" She didn't mention Jason's name, but the address printed at the bottom. The left corner of the photo was his. Jason picked one up from his lawn, photographed it, filed it. Elliot drafted a cease and desist letter the same day. Karen ignored it. That weekend, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, claiming Jason was creating an unsafe environment through surveillance, intimidation, and unapproved modifications. The board requested a meeting. Jason declined. He wasn't a member, he owed them nothing, but he sent them a packet legal exemption papers, property rights documentation, and a copy of the 911 call footage. 2 board members resigned quietly within the next week. One of them sent Jason a note. "We didn't know, I'm sorry." But Karen wasn't backing down. On Monday morning, Jason stepped outside to find the side of his car keyed, 3 deep, as he called the police. The officer who arrived was the same one from the previous visit. "You're not the problem, sir," he said. "She is." Jason watched as the officer walked across the street and knocked on Karen's door. She didn't answer, but the officer stood there for 5 minutes, staring at the camera Jason had installed just days ago. It was working slowly, quietly, legally, and it was far from over. Jason Reed had spent his career designing systems to withstand failure, redundancy, resilience, recovery. But what he now faced in Maple Hill Estates wasn't a system flaw. It was targeted sabotage disguised as authority. After the 911 incident, things didn't calm down, they escalated. His days blurred together, documenting flower beds trampled overnight, trash cans moved and overturned, strange chalk marks near his garage. One morning, a dead squirrel was found stuffed inside his mailbox. Another, his sprinklers were manually disabled. Each event was small, petty on its own, but together they formed a campaign. A deliberate, obsessive form of harassment, meant to drive him to anger or to flight. But Jason didn't break. He logged every detail, saved every clip, reported every incident to Elliot Crane, his attorney, who now had compiled over 80 pages of documented abuse. Elliot filed a restraining order against Karen Myers and emergency petition citing sustained psychological harassment and misuse of emergency services. The court issued a temporary order within 48 hours, restricting Karen from contacting Jason, his property, or making any additional reports without direct evidence. That, however, was just the beginning. Karen responded with fury cloaked in performative victimhood. She wrote a full-page letter to the HOA and distributed it through mailboxes, titled "The Threat Among Us," where she claimed she was being silenced by outsiders, and that compliance was being used as a weapon against those trying to preserve neighborhood harmony. She accused Jason of planting the dead animal in his own mailbox, of staging damage for sympathy, and of recording private lives without consent. Jason ignored the noise and focused on facts. With Elliot's help, he submitted a motion to access HOA meeting records. Though Jason wasn't a member, the HOA operated as a registered neighborhood governance body, which under state transparency laws, made their minutes public upon request. What the records revealed stunned both Jason and Elliot. Over the past 2 years, Karen had proposed over 40 unique amendments to the HOA charter, most of which were implemented without full vote. Many of them were reactionary, targeted. Fines for certain lawn decorations, limits on camera angles, restrictions on behavioral disturbances. In each case, the records showed a consistent pattern: Karen targeting new residents, often those who were single, elderly, or ethnically different from the majority. Elliot cross-referenced the names. 7 of the last 10 households fined heavily had either moved away or sold their homes at below market value. One property purchased by an LLC tied to Karen's brother had increased in value by 40% since acquisition. Jason and Elliot had seen enough. Elliot filed a formal complaint to the state's HOA Regulatory Council and launched a civil lawsuit against Karen Myers for defamation, harassment, and abuse of legal systems. It wasn't just about a camera anymore, it was about justice. Meanwhile, Jason installed a second camera system, this time with night vision, wide range, and a solar backup. He wasn't going to be caught unprepared. He also upgraded his firewall and internet security. A subtle ping had alerted him that someone attempted to access his Wi-Fi. He didn't have proof yet, but he had his suspicions. Then came the moment that pushed everything into high alert. On a rainy Wednesday night, Jason returned home late from a consultation with Elliot. As he pulled into his driveway, his headlights caught a shadow moving quickly across his side yard. He stopped, jumped out, and found nothing, but when he reviewed the camera feed, his breath caught. There, clearly, was Karen wearing a dark raincoat, face partially covered, stepping across the line of his property. She bent over near his water meter, held something in her hand, then vanished out of frame. Jason checked the meter box. Inside it, a small plastic bag filled with powder. Police were called immediately. Hazmat was dispatched. The powder was tested non-toxic, but the implication was clear. Planted evidence, a failed attempt at framing. Jason handed over the footage. Karen was arrested the next morning, charged with trespassing, violating a court order, and suspected evidence tampering. This time, she couldn't pretend. Her mugshot made a local paper. Her expression wasn't angry, it was shocked, humiliated, as if the camera had betrayed her control. Jason didn't celebrate. He wasn't vindictive, but for the first time in weeks he took a full breath. The neighborhood responded with silence. No more flyers, no more complaints. And yet, behind curtains, he could feel the eyes. Not hostile anymore, but cautious, watching. One neighbor, an older woman named Carolyn, left a note in his mailbox. "Thank you for standing up," it read. "She did this to my son when he moved in. He left within months. You stayed." The silence, however, didn't last. Karen made bail and was released pending trial, but this time her actions had caught up with her legally. News reports picked up the story. Local HOA president arrested for framing resident with fake evidence. Social media exploded. Jason's quiet street became the focus of reporters, podcasters, legal analysts. HOA horror stories from across the country surfaced under hashtags like #HOA Revenge and #Karen911. Jason received hundreds of emails, some thanking him, others sharing their own stories of HOA abuse. Elliot cautioned him not to speak publicly. "Yet we have leverage now. Don't give them room to spin it." Karen, on the other hand, tried to salvage what she could. She resigned from the HOA, claiming emotional instability, and filed her own countersuit alleging an emotional distress. It didn't stick. Elliot filed a motion to dismiss, backed by video evidence, timestamps, and sworn police reports. The judge threw it out in 20 minutes. Then came the real bombshell. A former HOA treasurer came forward, Mark Callahan. He had resigned quietly a year earlier but now provided a signed affidavit. Karen had directed fines toward certain residents strategically, using fake complaints as justification, and personally approved payment of HOA funds to a compliance contractor that was, in fact, her cousin under a false name. Mark included bank statements, emails, and call logs. Elliot amended the lawsuit adding fraud, misappropriation of funds, and abuse of HOA authority. The case grew. The state's HOA Oversight Board launched an internal investigation. The local prosecutor began building a criminal case. Jason still kept to himself. He still watered his lawn at 7 a.m., still took his walks at dusk, but neighbors started waving now. Some stopped to talk. One even asked if he'd consider running for the newly proposed neighborhood council. He declined politely. "I came here for peace," he said. "I didn't expect to become a legal witness." Still, he knew it wasn't over. Karen had been cornered, but people like her didn't surrender easily. They doubled down, and he was prepared, because this time, the system was watching her, not him. Jason Reed had begun his battle seeking only silence and fairness, but by the time the civil suit deepened into a web of corruption, it became painfully clear that his case was no longer just about him. The HOA's web of abuse stretched farther and deeper than anyone had realized. Since Karen's arrest and the release of Mark Callahan's sworn affidavit, Elliot Crane had initiated a parallel investigation into the financial operations of the Maple Hill Estates HOA, and what he found shattered the illusion of suburban order. HOA records, finally accessed through court-ordered discovery, revealed that nearly $250,000 of HOA dues had been allocated over 3 years for vague terms like property compliance enhancements, aesthetic reinforcements, and neighborhood cohesion services. These phrases meant nothing legally, but the attached payments were very real, with large checks written to shell companies traced back to Karen's extended family. The misappropriation of funds turned the civil case into a criminal one. The local district attorney's office now partnered with the state HOA regulatory authority and had frozen the HOA's accounts. Jason, once treated as a nuisance, was now the primary witness in what the media dubbed the Maple Hill HOA fraud ring. He found himself being contacted by journalists, HOA abuse victims from across the country, and lawyers seeking precedents. But Jason kept his focus. With Elliot's guidance, he provided every recorded video, email, and incident log, over 400 pieces of documented evidence. The timeline was undeniable. Karen had orchestrated a sustained campaign of intimidation and fraud under the guise of neighborhood preservation. What made it worse was how many people knew and stayed silent. Board members who abstained during votes, neighbors who quietly distanced themselves from fined households, and contractors who performed questionable repairs on properties under dispute or had, in some way, enabled the abuse. The weight of that silence hung heavy in the neighborhood. Though Karen had stepped down, her shadow remained. Rumors circulated that she was pressuring witnesses. One woman, Teresa Noble, claimed Karen had approached her in a grocery store parking lot, demanding she retract her complaint. When Teresa refused, her car was keyed that night. Another neighbor, Glenn Brooks, had his security lights shattered after he submitted financial statements to Elliot's team. Fear returned. The neighborhood's new temporary HOA committee tried to hold a meeting to stabilize the chaos, but fewer than 10 residents showed up, most too afraid to speak. Jason wasn't surprised. Abuse leaves scars that rules alone can't fix. But he didn't stop. At Elliot's request, he began meeting with state oversight officials to help draft new HOA reform policy. Meanwhile, Elliot prepared for the upcoming court hearing, which would formally decide the HOA's fate, either dissolve it entirely or place it under third-party administration. Jason testified in closed session with the district attorney, detailing everything from the first citation over the wind chime to the 911 call that could have ruined his life. His calm demeanor, evidence-backed statements, and precision made him a powerful witness. Karen's defense, now grasping at straws, tried to claim psychological distress, that she had felt unsafe due to Jason's aggressive energy, but that argument collapsed under surveillance footage, police reports, and the lack of any actual threats or infractions. Her lie about the 911 call was now being formally tried as criminal misuse of emergency services, and the tampering incident, involving the powder planted in Jason's meter box, was being considered for felony charges. Things escalated further when a whistleblower from within the HOA's law firm came forward anonymously, leaking email threads that showed Karen bragging about putting pressure on the new guy, mocking Jason's calm demeanor, and joking that he'll run like the last one if we hit hard enough. That same week, Jason received a subpoena for federal court. An inquiry had been launched into possible wire fraud, since several of the HOA's misappropriated payments were sent across state lines. What started as a neighborhood dispute had become a federal matter. The pressure on Karen's defense team became unbearable. Her attorney filed a motion for delay, citing stress and media influence, but the judge refused. The court scheduled the first day of the criminal trial. Jason's neighborhood was no longer what it had been. Some homes had gone dark. Residents moved out quietly, ashamed they had once supported Karen's regime. Others stepped forward publicly, sharing their stories. One elderly couple, the Dawsons, tearfully confessed during a press interview that they had remained silent while watching their neighbors fined unfairly, simply to avoid being targeted themselves. Jason understood their fear, but he also knew silence had a cost. At night, Jason sometimes sat in his study, staring at the digital archive he had built, folders upon folders of footage, documents, statements. He didn't feel proud, just resolved. The system didn't fail him. It tried to bury him, but he had fought back, pixel by pixel, file by file. Karen, out on bail, was now under house arrest, an ankle monitor tracking her every move. She lived 2 blocks away, in the same house from where she had once ruled over Maple Hill like a suburban monarch. Now her lawn was overgrown. Her porch light flickered. Her mailbox was taped shut. The HOA board, under court supervision, posted a public apology letter on every door. We acknowledge the failures of leadership and promised transparency moving forward. Few believed it. Jason received letters from residents thanking him for exposing the truth, but he knew the war wasn't won yet. Elliot warned him the trial could stretch for months, possibly longer, with delays and procedural blocks. But the foundation had cracked, and now it was only a matter of time before the entire facade collapsed. Jason kept walking the same path, every morning past the houses that once watched him with suspicion, past the children's bikes left safely outside, past the community bulletin board now stripped bare. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. The truth was waving for him. And that truth had a name, a case number, and a trial date stamped in bold. Karen's world was shrinking, and Jason's was finally expanding into something honest. The courtroom smelled of varnished wood and stale bureaucracy. But to Jason Reed, it was the most honest place he had stepped into since moving to Maple Hill Estates. The trial had finally begun, and Karen Myers was no longer the woman wielding warnings and HOA citations like weapons. Now she sat at the defendant's table, wrists trembling, face pale, her carefully composed suburban armor cracking under the weight of the charges brought against her. The courtroom was modest, just 2 rows of gallery benches, a single flag behind the judge's bench, and a ceiling fan that hummed like a ticking clock. Yet, the stakes were massive. Karen stood accused of multiple felonies, criminal misuse of emergency services, trespassing, harassment, evidence tampering, and fraud involving HOA funds. The prosecution opened with simplicity and strength, laying out a linear timeline of abuse that began with a wind chime and ended with a planted plastic bag of white powder. Jason, seated behind Elliot Crane at the plaintiff's table, watched silently, his expression unreadable. The lead prosecutor, a meticulous woman named Dana Whitmore, presented the jury with a binder thicker than a city phone book, filled with documentation, emails, audio logs, neighborhood complaints, surveillance footage. But it was the 911 recording that hit hardest. The courtroom grew still as the playback began. Karen's voice, hushed and urgent, describing Jason as possibly armed, unstable, and hostile. Then the video clipped Jason calmly watering his lawn while Karen filmed from a distance, whispering into her phone, eyes darting toward the mounted security camera. The footage spoke louder than words. Karen's defense attorney, a man named Wallace Green, tried to shift the narrative. He framed Karen as a woman under stress, overwhelmed by HOA responsibility, concerned for community safety. He played the sympathy card, emphasizing her lack of criminal history and presenting selected excerpts from her therapy sessions suggesting anxiety, paranoia, and trauma. But it didn't stick. The evidence was too strong, too precise. On the 3rd day, Jason took the stand. His testimony was clean, steady, and powerful, not emotional, but deeply human. He described moving into Maple Hill with the hope of peace, how the HOA leadership slowly began targeting him for not being part of their association, how false citations turned into subtle sabotage and eventually full-blown character assassination. "This wasn't about a security camera," he said at one point. "It was about control, and I didn't give in." The jury listened intently. Dana followed up with supporting testimony from the former HOA treasurer, Mark Callahan, whose calm admissions of internal manipulation landed like thunder in the quiet room. Mark confirmed the misappropriation of over $200,000 in HOA funds and detailed Karen's pattern of targeting non-compliant homeowners, particularly those who were new, lived alone, or were from diverse backgrounds. Her goal was influenced, and her methods were weaponized legality. The prosecution also presented financial trails leading to Karen's relatives, showing how HOA checks were funneled through fake contractor companies into personal accounts. But what truly shifted the mood was a witness who had not been publicly listed. Glenn Brooks. Glenn, a reserved man in his 60s, revealed he had been forced to sell his house 2 years earlier after being fined repeatedly for fabricated violations. He moved back into the area recently and came forward after seeing the news reports. His voice cracked on the stand as he said, "I didn't know I was being run out until it was too late." The jury watched him weep, and something unspoken shifted in the room. It wasn't just about Jason anymore, it was about every person Karen had silenced, fined, pushed, or frightened. Wallace tried to salvage what he could, pushing for a reduced sentence in exchange for a plea deal, but Dana refused. "You don't get to dismantle lives and then ask for leniency," she said flatly. "Not when you abused the one system people thought they could trust their neighborhood." The judge denied the motion. Closing arguments began on day 7. Dana painted a picture of systematic abuse, calling Karen a neighborhood tyrant in a cardigan, while Wallace attempted one last push, citing community pressure and emotional breakdown. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room exhaled. Jason stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, Elliot beside him. They said nothing for several minutes. Across the street, a news crew waited. Jason avoided the camera and kept walking. An hour later, the jury returned. The verdict: guilty on all counts. Karen's face crumpled, her hands shaking. The judge ordered her taken into custody immediately. No bail, no delay. The sentence would be issued in 30 days, but she would await it from a holding cell. Jason didn't feel joy. He felt release, like a steel chain across his chest had finally been unlocked. That night, the neighborhood remained quiet. No lights flickered from Karen's home. The porch where she once stood, issuing silent judgment, was now dark, vines growing wild across the railing. A few neighbors left notes on Jason's doorstep. "Thank you. You did what we couldn't. Now we can breathe." But Jason didn't celebrate. Instead, he began packing. It was time to go. Not because he was scared, but because his part in the fight was over. The property, now famous, received multiple offers, most above asking price. One came from a non-profit group seeking to turn it into a legal aid hub for HOA victims. Jason accepted. Elliot helped finalize the paperwork, and within 2 weeks, Jason Reed left Maple Hill Estates for good. The day he locked the door for the last time, he looked across the street, where a new family had just moved into Karen's former home. They smiled, waved, and Jason returned the gesture. Not with bitterness, but with hope. He didn't need revenge. He had the truth. And truth, as it turned out, didn't need approval from any HOA. Jason Reed thought his chapter with Maple Hill Estates had ended the day he closed the front door behind him for the last time. But the echo of what had happened there followed him further than he expected. The non-profit legal advocacy group that purchased his property moved fast. Within a month, it became a fully functional HOA accountability resource center fitted with a small staff, donated office furniture, and a front porch sign that read, "You have rights. Let's defend them." The center received over 300 emails in its first week. And not just from across the state. Complaints, inquiries, legal questions poured in from Arizona, Ohio, Florida, and California. Victims of HOA abuse, emboldened by Jason's case, were finally speaking out. Jason kept his distance. He had relocated to a quiet town 2 hours away, nestled near a wooded lake, far from HOA zones and neighborhood enforcement. He purchased a modest A-frame house with no covenants, no restrictions, and no meetings. For a while, he didn't answer unknown calls, didn't check the news, didn't speak of Maple Hill, but justice has a gravity of its own. Elliot Crane, still representing the active plaintiffs in the now expanded lawsuit, continued to keep Jason updated. Karen Myers was sentenced to 4 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the combined charges of 911 misuse, fraud, harassment, and evidence tampering. She was banned from participating in any HOA activity for life in order to pay restitution of over $180,000 to affected residents. But the most shocking part came after sentencing, when further investigation revealed she had been working in tandem with 2 other HOA leaders from adjacent districts. A regional web of power abuse was uncovered, and her arrest triggered the collapse of 3 other HOAs. News outlets picked up the story again. The Karen that broke the system, Maple Hill's legacy, HOA reform in motion, and how one security camera changed everything. A major documentary company reached out to Jason for an exclusive interview at first. He declined. But when he saw how survivors from all walks of life were standing up and sharing their stories, some weeping, others enraged, many defeated, but now hopeful, he agreed. The interview was quiet, filmed in a neutral room, no dramatic lighting. Jason simply spoke, calmly, truthfully, about what it felt like to be targeted, to be framed, to be silenced, and what it meant to fight back, even when no one believed him. When the film aired, it struck a nerve. HOA reform became a national conversation. State legislators introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency, limiting board power, and punishing false emergency reporting. Jason was invited to testify before a state committee. He didn't prepare a speech. He told his story, the way it happened. His closing sentence was short, but unforgettable. No one should fear their neighbor with a clipboard more than a burglar with a crowbar. Applause followed, quiet but sincere. Karen's name became a cautionary tale in legal circles, and her trial was taught in law school courses under ethics and abuse of administrative authority. But for Jason, recognition was never the goal. He stayed out of the spotlight after that, turning his attention to building something new, something honest. He began volunteering remotely for the legal center he helped create, reviewing case files, advising victims, sometimes just listening to people who needed to be heard. In time, they created a digital archive, a national HOA abuse database. Jason worked quietly, behind the scenes. One day he received a message from Caroline, the neighbor who had once left him a thank you note in Maple Hill. She wrote, "The street is different now. Kids play outside again. There are still rules, but now there's room to breathe." Attached was a photo, the community notice board. A new laminated message posted in the center read, "If you feel like something is wrong, you're probably right. Don't be quiet. Truth has power." It was Jason's original quote, printed in bold. He sat back and read the message 3 times, then he smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but a peaceful one. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows of his lakefront home, Jason lit a small lamp and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The same red chair he had once placed on his Maple Hill porch, the one that started it all, now rocked slowly in the breeze beside him. No citations, no letters, no Karen, just wind, water, and the sound of peace finally earned. His fight had never been about revenge, it had always been about truth. And in the end, truth had won.